Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome to the Genetics Podcast, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today with Angela Bradshaw, who's the Director of Research at Alzheimer Europe, which is an umbrella organization that collaborates with 41 national Alzheimer's Association from 36 European countries, so quite a spread. We're going to talk about pan-European collaborations. We're also going to dive deep into some of the major areas of research in dementia and Alzheimer's that Angela and the rest of the community are focused on. I want to start actually with how you got into this in the first place. You have quite a varied background. You've done research in oncology, you've worked in gene therapy, and I think from my understanding, you decided to take this position with Alzheimer's Europe due to almost a combination of some personal experiences with rare disease and dementia in your family, but then also obviously the research background that you bring to this. So I'd love to talk a little bit about how you got to where you are today.
Thanks, Patrick, and great to be here. Yeah, so I think a really common defining factor that I've found for scientists and researchers generally is a sense of curiosity, and that definitely has driven me throughout my life, from initially getting into science as someone who was really interested in animals, ecology and biology, and then eventually moving to the University of Cambridge to do my PhD, which was about sort of vascular contributions to cancer. So from there, I moved to the University of Glasgow and did initially a couple of postdocs, and then I got a fellowship and moved sort of up that career ladder. A lot of it was really focused on the vascular compartment, so some of these vascular conditions that affect people as they get older, but also a really strong focus was gene therapy. So using, in my case, viruses as vectors to deliver gene sequences in an aim to treat or modify disease processes. And I guess kind of into this mix of quite a varied research background came some personal experiences. And my second daughter, Charlotte, was born with a very rare skin condition, a genetic skin condition called ichthyosis. So the incidence is about, for her particular type of ichthyosis, which is fairly severe, is around 1 in 250,000. So immediately that kind of plunges you into a very different view of research. You know, you very much think about research as, what can it offer me? What can it offer my family? What can it offer patients? We did quite a lot of outreach work. So we would do public engagement work, going into schools, going to community centres and talking about the research that we were doing. But it really sort of thrust into the spotlight the need for kind of understanding the views and the perspectives and the values of patients who are really the ultimate end users of research, right? You know, we're all wanting to provide innovations that support, whether it's diagnosis, treatment, whether you're in a lab modifying cells, or whether you are collecting data or samples from patients. The general underlying goal is the same. So when my daughter was born, it really sort of pushed me into a very different space, because immediately you're very worried. Everything is very new. You're faced with a whole range of different challenges. Your day-to-day is completely shifted. You spend a lot of time talking with doctors. You spend, as a scientist, a lot of time using those skills to try and understand the condition and see what it might turn into, how it might develop. And actually, you know, with rare diseases like ichthyosis and others, very little is known. So it really strikes very close to home the value of research, but also the imperative of involving patients. And then around a similar time, a few years later, a close friend of the family who was kind of a surrogate grandmother to us when we were kids, developed some cognitive impairment, which was then diagnosed as vascular dementia. But the whole process of getting that diagnosis and then eventually, you know, supporting with care for this person was really, really hard, actually, especially, you know, living far from or relatively distant from her. So again, it really sort of struck home that there are a lot of challenges, I guess, in the real world. And this meant that when an opportunity came up at Alzheimer Europe to join the team as a product officer back in my home country, it really felt like a fantastic opportunity to take some of those research learnings, some of that inherent curiosity, also personally enjoying meeting people with different perspectives and views and trying to find a way to work collaboratively. And I kind of fell into this role, and it's been fantastic.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, and you've been there for a while, so you've seen quite a bit of evolution in the field, I think, over the past few years. I'd love to get your perspective today on, when we talk about research, we can think about everything from early basic science to early detection, diagnostics, therapeutics, clinical trials, also practical research about how do we better support people with the challenges that they're having today that have nothing to do with gene therapy or biology, right? How do I better navigate the world around me or help my family member? When you think about the vast range of things that we could be focusing our efforts and resources on, what are the couple things that stand out to you as the biggest priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to perspective. So there are, as a condition, dementia and Alzheimer's disease are hugely heterogeneous. They're really, really prevalent. There's around currently 9 to 10 million people in Europe who are living with Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. And that figure is set to triple by 2050 in Europe alone. So,
Wow.
This is a growing health concern. And especially in some of the Western geographies, in some Asian geographies as well, with really, really aging demographics, it's something that's going to be more and more important to address head on. And I think what I've learned in the last 5 or 6 years with Alzheimer Europe is there are huge gaps in the availability of really quite fundamental things that people need. Things like information, care, support. Some of these are linked to research. Other things are very much more focused around social and care aspects. So, but thinking about the more research sort of clinical needs, I mean, it's been a very exciting couple of years for Alzheimer's disease and dementia research, because in Europe, we've had very recently an approval of the first disease-modifying therapy. The US is a few years ahead of us. They've got 2, 3 that have been approved so far. 2 are available. And there's kind of a diagnostics revolution as well that's been happening. So whereas traditional diagnostic methods have very much relied on neuropsychological tests, maybe a CT scan, some neuroimaging, a lot of the time you're not getting what we call a molecular diagnosis of dementia. And I think that the doors and the opportunities for disease-modifying therapy are really going to come when you have that more specific diagnosis. And that's what we're standing at the cusp of. So for me, in terms of some really exciting developments, on the diagnostic front, I think, it would be great to see a sustained push and a sustained collaborative push to really help some of those biomarkers go the final mile. And those biomarkers have been developed so elegantly. I mean, the scientists, to me, there's some beautiful science that's been done linking some of the initial molecules and proteins that are involved in pushing the disease process forward to identifying how they are present in blood and cerebrospinal fluid samples. And then focusing on blood, which is obviously a much easier biofluid to obtain, really finding an array of different tests and tools that can be used to detect those very first early signs of Alzheimer's disease developing. So, in terms of what is needed, though, at the moment, we have a lot of the research understanding, but what we don't really have is an understanding of how these biomarkers behave in different populations. So I think for me, there's a really big gap in terms of diversity. And I think that's where we could maybe focus more efforts at the moment, really on in terms of the clinical research, expanding our research into the less well-represented populations. And this is not just about ethnic diversity. This is, that there are differences between populations, individuals, depending on where they live. Alzheimer's disease is very much influenced by lifestyle and things we do on a day-to-day basis. So really just expanding, growing, being more inclusive and getting more information. And I think genetics has a role to play in that too.
So those biomarkers that you're talking about, for people who aren't familiar with the field, what are the 1 or 2 or few that are useful, and how early are they useful? I'm curious. Are they coinciding with some of the very earliest symptoms that are manifesting at a memory level, or are they even earlier than that, where you can pick them up in blood, for example, years before you might notice it in a family member?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think there's always a temptation as researchers and scientists to go as early as physically possible, right?
Yeah.
Can we find something at birth that's going to tell you
Right.
something about what's going to happen in 20 years' time, and then you can do something about it? And, I'll come on to a bit later on some of the ethical challenges in doing that, right? Because, as mentioned, Alzheimer's disease, dementias are really heterogeneous. If you're telling someone, well, in 20 years' time, you may develop Alzheimer's disease or dementia, that's a scary thing to hear. So you have to be really careful about how you deliver those words and those messages, but also making sure that the science behind it is as robust as possible. So, you're looking at certainties, basically. You want to communicate certainties, but if you don't have them, communicate the uncertainty too, so people can deal with the information. But in terms of named biomarkers, in the Alzheimer's disease field, there's a lot of attention originally was placed or focused on the amyloid beta protein. So the initial blood-based biomarkers and fluid biomarkers looked at ratios of different types of amyloid beta proteins. But at the moment, the types of proteins that are really coming to the fore are the tau protein. And there's some really elegant and fairly convincing work coming out of groups across Europe and beyond, looking at different types of phosphorylated tau proteins that can be detected in the blood and that reflect the process of neurodegeneration in the brain. And actually, there are quite a few studies now showing that these can be detected. These and other proteins can be detected really quite early in the disease process. So this is maybe not, when someone is 15, but certainly as people, reach their 40s, 50s, 60s, and are beginning to show signs of a more advancing disease process, there you can start picking up changes in these biomarkers. But I think the important thing really is to say that, a biomarker alone is not diagnostic. I think, not at the moment anyway. We need more research. We need more data really to use biomarkers convincingly as sole blood-based biomarkers as sole single diagnostic. But as a complement to existing diagnostics, I think they've got huge potential.
Where is the science at right now in terms of breaking down you referenced the fact that we have a very broad category, but it's actually a very heterogeneous group of diseases. How much is it that we understand the fundamental biology because the basic science has been done to say that, I think this is probably an open question, but ApoE44 carriers are maybe different in some fundamental way than non-carriers, and so we should think about them differently. Is that an open question where we're actually still trying to figure out what are the groups we should be going after, or are there pretty clear groups that are emerging and now we need to figure out how do we treat those groups or care for them differently?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And with science and research, more is usually always better. I'd say for the ApoE4, the E4 genotype, there's been a few very recent publications. I think last summer there was a Nature Medicine publication that really focused very much on that group. And they were very, maybe, I don't know if categorical is the word, but they showed some really interesting data suggesting perhaps that E4, E4 could be people who have that combination could be labeled as being pre-symptomatic Alzheimer's disease patients. But for me, I think the jury is perhaps still out on the ability to give that as a diagnosis or as a message to patients. It's certainly a compelling idea because there's solid evidence to show that people with that combination of variants of ApoE are certainly at much higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and that is the cognitive impairment associated with Alzheimer's disease. So, Alzheimer's disease for some people, if it's defined biologically, people could go their whole lives with positive amyloid biomarkers and not necessarily develop cognitive impairment.
Interesting.
So I think we've got to be careful and be aware of that. It's not very definitive. But for E4, E4, I think there's a growing body of evidence. And actually with ApoE specifically, you've also got ApoE2 and ApoE3 and other variants as well. And that's really interesting too, because some are protected. So I think there's a lot of interest in that gene in particular, but there are also studies where they've looked more broadly. They've taken much wider sort of GWAS type approaches, and they've identified sort of polygenic risk scores, a number of other genes that make some contributions. And if you group those genes into different processes, what people are saying is neuroinflammation is something to really consider. So targeting some of the glial cells, for example, some of the more inflammatory components in the brain is also something that will be important. And for me, I think the picture that's emerging more generally is as a heterogeneous, multifactorial disease, we're not going to see a silver bullet. It's actually incredibly rare ever to find a silver bullet for most diseases. It's a nice idea, but in reality, it's incredibly rare. So for Alzheimer's disease especially, I think what we're hearing from experts in the field is that we're going to be looking at combination therapies. So we're looking at more detailed diagnoses, which will complement combination therapies. But that's not to overlook the need for all types of other support and the value of non-pharmacological therapies too, which is something that, is maybe not as familiar to many biomedical researchers, but provides huge value to people who are affected by dementia. And another concern we have as an organization, and I'll stop there because I'm sure there's another question coming, but it's very tempting to be drawn into the idea of a very early diagnosis, a fairly early treatment, medical treatment, and then everything's going to be fine. But actually, there's a huge number of people for whom that may not work, for whom that may not be accessible. So when we think about research, and this maybe speaks to the idea of areas of research that need more investment, we need to think about providing things for people who will not be able to benefit from those types of diagnostics and treatments because they make up a huge proportion of the population currently and in the future.
Who are those people that won't benefit at all or won't benefit as much?
Well, I mean, actually it's and it's quite a scary thing to think about, but it's not people who are based in extremely rural areas who are necessarily just those individuals who are from more deprived backgrounds or whatever. It could be your aunt, who is going to her GP and the GP is not sure, there's not a huge amount they can offer. They'll be sent home to a watch and wait approach, and then 2 years go by and you still don't have a diagnosis. So it's people who are living in towns and communities around the corner from you, from me, from people living in Europe and people in the US.
That's something that's become so apparent to me working in genetics, and it's the case in diagnostics and biomarkers more broadly, that there is a total lottery around what your doctor in genetics, just very specifically, what your doctor even thinks about genetics, and whether they are super excited by it or think it's all it's all useless. And the truth is often somewhere in the middle, right? Like you said, there's no silver bullet, but very often that can drive a multi-year delay in whether you get referred to testing because the person that you speak to might not, or they might not just be even aware of what's out there, right? There's a big awareness and education gap. Yeah, that's
absolutely. And that's a big challenge to address, not just for healthcare professionals, but also just for the general public. That there's a huge stigma around, and this is something that I've learned, both personally and professionally. There's a huge and very particular stigma around Alzheimer's disease and dementia that doesn't always exist with other conditions.
Sure.
A lot of fear around it. And I know the narrative is shifting a little bit currently. People are talking about brain health and the possibility for prevention and lifestyle modification. So, everyone can be empowered to do something. But, that message isn't getting out everywhere. And I think people, there's something particular about the brain. It speaks to who we are as individuals.
So true.
That there's stigma around cancer and there's a great fear around terms like that. But I think there's a special stigma around Alzheimer's disease and dementia. And a perception maybe as well that you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
So let's ignore it as long as we can.
Yeah, that's a great segue actually into the last question around this. Probably not the last, I say the last, but I always have a follow-up around therapeutics and clinical trials, because I think these issues cascade downstream. If diagnostics aren't where they need to be, it makes clinical trials harder. But I think this point you just made is one as well. If I just think about getting something going into my brain, I feel different about that than something going into my liver or going into my kidney. But nonetheless, we've had successes in the past couple of years that are firsts for the field. And I'd love to just have your perspective on that, because I think on the one hand, people are very excited that we've had successes for the first time ever. But there's also challenges with how much we're willing to pay as health systems for how much benefit people are getting from those. I'd love to just have your perspective on that in general.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, as an organization, we, as Alzheimer Europe, we've been following these developments really closely over the years, and it's a big point of interest for our member associations, for the people we represent, and for us as an organization. And we did some work last year and before that on anti-amyloid therapy. So these are the new class of treatments that are coming through, disease-modifying therapies, and I guess it's kind of a lot of the time what we hear from our colleagues in the dementia community is, you need a first drug. you need a first disease-modifying therapy. You need a first medicine that does something, and then that opens the door for successive generations of treatment. That was seen for HIV, for example, as first therapies with huge side effects, but were phased out, and now there's very good solutions to manage that condition. So, our hope is that we're going to see something similar for Alzheimer's disease, because the current therapies that have recently been made available in Europe, made available, we're still waiting on European Commission ratification of the EMA decision, but that's kicked off. That initial EMA checkbox or approval will mean, theoretically anyway, at least treatments will be accessible or marketable in Europe. But they aren't perfect. The side effects are really quite substantial for certain groups of individuals. So we've been really encouraged by the fact that there's been a very mindful and careful approach taken by the regulators in collaboration with companies to try and limit these risks as much as possible, really to narrow the population. And that's how, one of the drugs got through at the European Medicines Agency. The indication was narrowed very, very, fairly substantially to exclude people who are equally for homozygote, actually. And that can increase the safety of these drugs. So, we think there's a huge amount of promise. Disease-modifying therapies are hugely needed, but this is just the beginning. We are very excited about the potential for disease-modifying therapies. We are encouraged by the fact that companies are really investing in this space again. There's been a huge amount of investment in the last 20, 30 years by companies. A lot of that hasn't resulted in a marketable product. So, that there was a degree of discouragement, I guess, but we're really glad to see that there are positive steps being taken. And we really hope to see in 10, 15 years, the availability of these therapies for people who could benefit in a safe way, but also in a way that doesn't cost the healthcare systems an arm and a leg. Because the reality is, if you look at the numbers of individuals with early Alzheimer's disease who could benefit from current therapies, it's a fraction of the whole community. So we need to make sure that those individuals aren't overlooked, and also the people who don't have Alzheimer's disease, whether it's Alzheimer's disease dementia or MCI due to Alzheimer's disease, people with frontotemporal dementia, people with some of the other forms, vascular dementia, etc., are not overlooked, because that's another challenge for us, I think, as an organization that represents patient associations.
I was thinking as you were talking about that, one of our past guests, let me quickly look up his episode number, Mark Taylor, episode 157, made this really interesting point. He was talking about the UK, but I think it applies across Europe as well, that when you get into the highest risk bracket of, say, a new therapeutic getting approved, there's actually generally very straightforward, they can be complex and rigorous, but straightforward ways of getting it approved. So you go to the EMA and there's a million steps that you have to go through, but it's actually very clear and well documented, and you can get approval across all of Europe. And now then decisions are made in individual European countries around reimbursement and those kind of decisions. But when you go to the other end of the spectrum of collaborating around diagnostics or basic science, there's not a framework that says, okay, here is how you collaborate with the entire continent of Europe or all European member states. And actually, most of the research that I think you all are focused on is in this bucket of, there is no framework and you have to figure out how to coordinate together. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, maybe one of the major pan-European projects that you work on as an example of how you actually coordinate 30 plus member states or 30 plus different organizations together to try to do something. Because it's Europe is on par with the US in terms of population and GDP, but it's just structured completely differently, right? So you have to think about it differently.
Yeah, indeed. And actually, I'm very glad that we don't have to coordinate or deal with 30 member states or 27 member states, because that would be actually impossible. I mean, I think it's one of the beautiful things about Europe for me. I mean, bringing it back to a slightly more personal point, I grew up in Luxembourg, which is a tiny country neighbored by three much larger countries. And it's sort of small but mighty and very, very interesting in the types of people who grow up and live there, because it's so international. It has to be pan-European. It was one of the founding members of the European community back in the 1950s. And, growing up there due to having a parent who worked at the European Commission really kind of embedded the European spirit in myself. And I think in a lot of my friends and colleagues who come from the European school, or at least, that type of environment. And as an organization, I mean, the clues in the name, Alzheimer Europe, we have to have some understanding and some consideration of these differences across member states and across different environments. And actually, it's quite mind-boggling because, the disease where area we're interested in, it's hugely complex, but then all the different stakeholders are hugely diverse as well. And if you factor in individual countries, you have whole universes, black holes maybe of people with interest and that needs to be involved. And I think what we try and do when we get involved in research projects and we get involved as a partner, we don't coordinate these research projects because they're really driven by the science. So it tends to be a scientific coordinator usually who leads them. But we get involved to try and bring some of that sort of societal perspective in to the really important and interesting science that's being done. Examples always help. So I could maybe pull a couple, one that's maybe more general, not specific to Alzheimer's disease, and then another one that's more to do with Alzheimer's disease. So maybe one is a more general example, and this is actually quite relevant to the topic because it's really focused on data sharing. And this is it's a project called the European Platform for Neurodegenerative Diseases, and it's supported by the Innovative Medicines Initiative. And this is the IMI, or which is currently exists as the IHI, the Innovative Health Initiative, is a really interesting way of creating platforms for collaborative research that span countries and span sectors. So for these types of projects, you bring in academic centers, places where innovation is happening, the sort of the seeds of ideas are coming from the academic centers, but you're also bringing companies into this space. These can be large pharmaceutical companies, but they can also be smaller SMEs. And they really emphasize the importance of involving patient organizations, but also considering the regulatory perspectives. So it's really about, accelerating the implementation of research innovations in the real world. And to do that, you need everyone involved. So for this particular project, which I can shorten to EPND because otherwise we'd go on and on forever, what they're trying to do is they're trying to advance and accelerate the development of biomarkers for neurodegenerative diseases generally. So this has been really interesting for us because it's brought us together with organizations that support people with Parkinson's disease, with ALS, with other disease communities as well. And what they're trying to do is promote data and sample sharing. So, and I think this is particularly relevant for genetics and genomics because, the power and the insights that you can get from these large data sets is pretty unparalleled. And in this particular project, there are 29 partners. So it's a big wow. thing. The mailing lists are hefty. There are 200 people. Meetings are large. And what we're trying to do really is collaboratively develop tools and resources to help people share data and samples, advance biomarker development and qualification, and really sort of help develop new diagnostics and treatments, be supportive and help facilitate research. And the way that works in practice is, I'm not going to say it always works really well because people are people, individual companies and entities will have different priorities. But I think what really inspires me about those types of collaborations is creating a space for people to get into a room together and talk about their priorities and, feed those priorities back to the primary researchers so that when something is developed, you have the end user in mind, whether it's a researcher who wants to share data in this particular example, or in other examples, like another project called AD-RIDDLE, which is developing new clinical pathways for diagnosis, detection, and prevention for Alzheimer's disease, a much more clinical project, but really putting the end user perspective at the heart. And that's not to say that the researchers' views aren't important too. Of course they are. They really drive the project. But it's a really nice way to co-create research and co-create outcomes of research that will be of value and hopefully will be reimbursed by healthcare systems.
Yeah, how that strikes me as something that would be a challenge for diagnostics developers are there common frameworks for reimbursement across Europe, or do you need to think about it in each individual country? I know the UK has made it probably more difficult by leaving because they've got their own thing going. They always have, though.
But yeah, well, there's I'm half Irish, so I have to say that there's a lot of good stuff coming out, and there's fantastic research being done in the UK on the dementia front. DOI and others, brilliant stuff happening. I mean, in terms of reimbursement frameworks, those in Europe, those happen at a national level, and they have to happen at a national level because generally healthcare systems are very different. Just thinking of more sort of politically, Europe has expanded a lot over the years. It's also contracted slightly a few years back, but we won't talk too much about that. But the collaboration and regulatory cooperation in Europe is limited to certain aspects. So, there are shared regulations. The GDPR is one that everyone will probably be aware of, which regulates data protection. But in terms of access to health and the way health is delivered, that is very much devolved to the member states. But there are sort of shared regulatory and HTA pathways. And actually, Europe is now moving towards creating structures to bring those health technology assessment pathways in more alignment, partly due to the need for faster research and faster implementation of research, but also, just sometimes we can cut down on, well, I won't say cut down on regulation because that's not really what the EU does necessarily, but, sometimes you can learn things from HTA agencies in other countries that you can then use in your own context. So just to cite a specific example, we have the European Medicines Agency, obviously, that regulates the approval of medicines across Europe. Companies don't have to go to the EMA for their regulatory approvals, but obviously there's an advantage there because a single approval will therefore mean that in all the member states, plus Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland, you can then market your product. On the HTA front, which is where you get assessment of the value of the medicines for society, there is a new regulation called the HTA regulation. And what they're looking at moving towards is something called a joint clinical assessment. And what that will be is a kind of, it's optional. Individual countries are not mandated to take those into account. However, this joint clinical assessment process has a potential to do a single HTA process for a new medicine, a device, or whatever that could then be used in the national healthcare context. And hopefully, with my kind of rose-tinted glasses on, hopefully that will help in making sure that people have equal access to new medicines, diagnostics, and other devices in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense to me. If it's well designed, then, I mean, going back to a country like Luxembourg at 650,000 people population, it doesn't make sense to do most of these things at a national level. So if you can have a broader umbrella coordinating function that allows you to trust the process that's happening and do the things that you really need to do specifically in that country locally, it certainly is going to make sense for the smaller countries. I wonder about Germany and UK, and some of the bigger ones may choose to go their own way, but that, there's a rationale to that as well that I can understand.
Yeah. I mean, I think, fundamentally it's about providing different options for different situations. So allowing and trying to tie this back to Alzheimer's disease and dementia diagnosis and treatment, making sure that everyone, every institution, country, organization has an option in a particular space, so you can tailor things to individual circumstances, whether it be a national decision-making body who needs to decide how to make or if to make a therapy available, to treatments. That's everyone would like, I think, to have, and this has certainly been my personal experience. In an ideal world, when you go and see a doctor and you are told of a diagnosis, you want to have options. You want to be able to have things that you can choose between that will work for you as an individual. That's the goal. And I think there's great potential from a genetic perspective for that personalized approach, but it's very hard to do in practice.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about gene therapies, actually, because you have a background in that, and it's something that is becoming more and more real in Alzheimer's. This early clinical trials, one that I think, reported out relatively recently. I wanted to get your perspective on that, because on the one hand, it feels very promising to me, especially you talked about ApoE2 being protective. There are a number of companies that are trying to basically deliver via gene therapy in order to essentially deliver that protective effect. On the other hand, though, it's, the delivery is hard. It often requires, very, very intensive, inpatient surgeries or other very specialized work. I just wanted to get your perspective on whether you feel like that's something that, say, in this decade before we get to 2030 is going to really be quite prominent, or if there's still some fundamental work to be done before we see gene therapies having an impact in the brain.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, gene therapies, biological therapies, generally, advanced therapy, medicinal products, which is a class that they belong to when you think about classes of medicines, they're really, really very interesting things. They've got particular promise and value for sort of genetic, monogenic, inherited disorders. And I think they've proved their value there. But then in recent years, there's been developments in, for example, the cancer fields, where you've got some really fantastic or really sort of nice innovations. Yescarta, for example, where you're seeing very good results thanks to these sort of biological therapy approaches. In Alzheimer's disease, but for gene therapy, I think you mentioned one of the challenges there in terms of getting transduction of the brain. And that's something that I grappled with as a scientist when I was doing postdoctoral work. We were looking at trying to target the brain in sort of smaller models of disease. And, as you're probably aware, it's incredibly challenging. There's a small number. If you want to get a gene into that type of space, you've got to cross a number of barriers, both physical and in terms of things like the blood-brain barrier. And fortunately, through some of the very fundamental work that my colleagues did at the time, a number of vectors are now available to get therapeutic genes into the brain, have no associated viruses and others. So I think the idea is very appealing. The science is still quite early. Given the length of time it takes to get a therapy from, preclinical phase 1 all the way through to an approved therapy, I don't see it happening in the next 5 years, perhaps 10, I don't know. But I think you've also got the sort of underlying question of what are you trying to achieve and is it the best way to achieve it? So I think for certain patients who are very well phenotyped, very well characterized, something like a gene therapy could be very attractive and might offer some of that permanent disease modifying, silver bullet type treatment. And perhaps, if you're using an AAV or something that can maintain transduction in a longer time period, maybe it's something that could be cheaper than a drug that you have to deliver once a month or once every 2 weeks. We're not quite there yet, but the research is certainly very exciting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's a really great point you made about segmenting the population. I think, for example, FTD, where you have frontotemporal dementia, where you have very rare and specific genes, I could see that being one of the first dominoes to fall compared to something like broad Alzheimer's, right? Where if you're delivering a protective genetic variant to broad Alzheimer's, I could see that taking a very long time to work out compared to picking off some of these rarer genetic subtypes.
Yeah, absolutely. But you still need to do the work, in order to, you've got to have that kind of blue sky thinking. And that's where you get the really big breakthroughs coming through. So it's not to say that the research isn't valid. It's just more research needs to be done. But I think fundamentally it comes down to diagnosis and really understanding the disease and what the disease looks like at an individual level, whether it's the genetic background, but also, how does that disease feel for the individual? What are the lifestyle factors that might be affecting it? How is that person navigating their daily life? I think that there's a lot of different levels at which we can help, or people can help, let's say clinicians, society, care institutions, patient organizations as well. So I think having a more holistic approach more generally will yield best results for the individual.
Yeah. As we close up here, something we ask every guest to do is fill out a form that gives us a little bit of perspective on fun stories or things that you want to talk about. One thing that stood out to me was you spent 50 hours on a bus traveling between northern and southern Australia. Tell me about that. Was that by choice or what did you see along the way? There's some camels in the middle of the country. I understand.
Yeah, there's a few things. Wow, yeah, no, I mean, my personal perspective at the time was, oh my goodness, this is quite sore. Because being seated for that length of time with just the occasional toilet break, and then I think we had a 5-hour break in Alice Springs, is not the most comfortable process. But yeah, I mean, I think this sort of coming back, I think individual people, you always have something that defines you as an individual. I think when I think of my kids, I can see that one is really curious and inquisitive, and the other one is really much more about sort of really understanding and deep analysis. And for me, curiosity has always been a driving factor. And that led me to Australia when I was about 18 or 19, a couple of years I spent there. And because I was doing voluntary work, obviously money was tight and therefore transport was by whatever the cheapest possible route was. And in this case, it was a bus. And it was a Greyhound bus from Darwin down to South Australia, so Adelaide, via Alice Springs. So it takes, I think it's something like 57 hours or something. I can't remember exactly. And I may have embellished it slightly because it was fairly,
if I felt like 50 hours.
Yeah,
Alice Springs is famous for its camel races, right? Did you?
Yeah, I didn't see any of that. We had 5 hours, during which I think what we did is, I think we walked around as much as we physically could just to stretch our legs. And I have a memory of sitting in a dried up riverbed, having a nice coffee or something in a dried up riverbed with a couple of the other students who were traveling with me. But no, it was interesting. It was a long journey. It was in the sort of mid to late 90s. So entertainment was minimal. There are only so many books you can pack as well. So there was one tiny TV in the middle of the bus showing really, really terrible ancient films. So, there was very little to do apart from look out the window. And what you saw a lot of the time was beautiful. And it was, the positive angle was seeing how the landscape changes as you cross the country.
Yeah.
So
I
that
did
was
something
really
kind of similar
mind-blowing.
actually with my now wife, girlfriend at the time, we were volunteering and traveling in Peru, and we made the decision to save $50 to take a bus instead of fly from one end to the other. And so it was supposed to be a 16-hour bus, but then the bus broke down. It turned into about 20. But we learned after that we'd probably just save and spend the $50 on the flight. It was like
Yeah.
of something like a 45-minute flight or something, or a 16-hour bus. But we got to see a lot of the country. We had fun, but we never did it again.
Yeah, and you meet interesting people, because people who are traveling that way usually are people who are locals, and
Yeah.
we heard a lot of interesting stories. I have to say that sort of sights and smells were not always very pleasant, because a 50-hour bus journey with one toilet.
No.
I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. To a very hot and sweaty country in the top end, but yeah, I don't know. You do stuff when you're young.
For
I don't
sure.
know if I do
Yeah.
it now.
It's a season of life, right? If you don't do it when you're young, you're definitely not going to do it when you're a little bit older. So you might as well do it. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. I appreciate you sharing all your perspective on, quite a few things: Alzheimer's disease research, but also pan-European collaborations and some fun towards the end. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. And thanks everybody, as always, for listening. If you have any feedback, guest recommendations, anything you want to hear, then don't hesitate to get in touch. We'll see you next time. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Cynogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit cynogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible. In particular, Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah, who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selective Frequencies, who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.